Hashtag give me one shot. Part 1. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she adjusted her scope for the 100th time that morning. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before her, heat waves dancing across the barren landscape like ghosts. At 28, she had already spent 6 years as a civilian contractor working with various military units, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just another support staff member watching from the sidelines. The Navy SEAL training facility buzzed with activity as Team Alpha prepared for their final marksmanship assessment. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were among the most elite warriors in the world, men who had survived Hell Week, advanced combat training, and countless missions in hostile territories. Their reputation preceded them everywhere they went, and their confidence was as solid as the weapons they carried. Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison led the team with the kind of authority that came from years of successful operations. His weathered face told stories of battles fought in places most people couldn't pronounce, and his steady hands had never failed him when it mattered most. Beside him stood Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, whose precision with a rifle had earned him legendary status among his peers. The third member, Petty Officer First Class David Rodriguez, was known for his ability to hit targets that others couldn't even see. Sarah had been observing their training for weeks now, documenting their performance and analyzing their technique for the advanced weapons program she helped coordinate. She understood every aspect of long-range shooting: the mathematics of ballistics, the physics of wind resistance, the psychology of maintaining focus under pressure. What she lacked was the opportunity to prove that knowledge translated into skill. The morning's exercise involved a series of increasingly difficult shots at distances ranging from 800 to 1,200 yards. The targets were small, barely visible to the naked eye, and the desert wind created variables that could throw off even the most experienced marksman. The SEALs had been preparing for this assessment for months, knowing that their performance would determine their selection for an upcoming high-priority mission. Commander Harrison stepped up to the firing line first, his custom rifle gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The range fell silent except for the whisper of wind across the sand. Sarah watched through her spotting scope as he settled into position, his breathing slow and controlled. The shot rang out across the desert, echoing off distant mountains. The target remained unmarked, a miss that surprised everyone present. Chen took his position next, his reputation for perfection weighing heavily on his shoulders. Sarah could see the slight tension in his jaw as he aligned his shot, compensating for the crosswind that had affected Harrison's attempt. The second shot cracked through the air, and again the target remained clean. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Rodriguez, determined to salvage the team's performance, approached the line with grim concentration. He had studied the wind patterns all morning, calculated every variable twice, and felt confident in his preparation. His shot was the most precise of the three, coming within inches of the target center, but still not achieving the required hit. The training officer, Colonel Patricia Webb, shook her head in disappointment. This wasn't just about marksmanship. This team was scheduled to deploy on a mission where precision shooting could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The parameters were clear. They needed someone who could guarantee hits at extreme range under adverse conditions. Sarah had been listening to the discussions about the upcoming mission for weeks. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target would be appearing at a specific location, but the only viable shooting position was over 1,000 yards away with challenging environmental factors. The mission couldn't proceed without absolute confidence in the marksman's ability. As the SEALs discussed their performance and prepared for another round of attempts, Sarah found herself calculating the shots they had missed. She had been tracking the wind patterns all morning, noting the subtle shifts that the sophisticated equipment couldn't always detect. Years of studying ballistics had given her an intuitive understanding of how projectiles behaved in different conditions. The conversation around her grew more intense as the implications of the failed shots became clear. Colonel Webb was already discussing the possibility of postponing the mission or finding alternative approaches. The SEALs, frustrated by their uncharacteristic performance, debated adjustments to their equipment and techniques. Sarah knew that speaking up would be seen as presumptuous. She was a civilian contractor, a technical analyst whose job was to observe and document, not to participate. The military hierarchy was clear about such boundaries, and suggesting that she could succeed where elite Navy SEALs had failed would be seen as both arrogant and naive. But as she watched the teams struggle with the same challenges that had defeated them all morning, Sarah felt a growing certainty that she understood something they were missing. The wind patterns weren't random. They followed a predictable cycle based on the desert's thermodynamics. The shooting position had a subtle cant that affected bullet trajectory in ways the standard calculations didn't account for. Most importantly, the targets themselves were positioned at angles that created optical illusions about their actual distance and size. The SEALs were exceptional soldiers, trained in combat tactics and mission execution that Sarah could never match. But marksmanship at this level was as much about understanding the science as it was about military training. Sarah had spent years studying every aspect of long-range shooting, from the molecular structure of different ammunition types to the effects of altitude on ballistic performance. Colonel Webb's radio crackled to life with updates from higher command. The mission timeline was fixed. If the team couldn't demonstrate the required marksmanship skills within the next few hours, the entire operation would be scrubbed. Months of planning and intelligence gathering would be wasted, and a critical opportunity to eliminate a high-value target would be lost. Harrison gathered his team for a strategy session, their voices low but intense as they discussed possible solutions. Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in their postures. These men had never failed a mission parameter, and the thought of being the reason for a mission cancellation was clearly devastating. The desert sun climbed higher, making the heat shimmer more pronounced and the shooting conditions even more challenging. Sarah realized that with each passing hour, the thermal effects would make accurate shooting increasingly difficult. If someone was going to make these shots, it would have to be soon. She found herself gripping her notebook tighter as she watched the team prepare for another attempt. Every fiber of her professional training told her to remain silent and continue her observer role. But another part of her, the part that had spent countless hours perfecting her understanding of marksmanship, knew that she might be looking at the solution to their problem. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This wasn't just about hitting targets on a range. Real lives hung in the balance, and the success or failure of a critical mission depended on finding someone who could make impossible shots under the worst possible conditions. As Sarah watched the SEALs line up for their second round of attempts, she made a decision that would change everything. The words formed in her mind before she could second-guess herself, and she knew that once she spoke them, there would be no going back. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another long, hot day. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled patiently, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah understood that feeling perfectly. She had been circling this opportunity for years, and now it was time to either seize it or watch it disappear forever. The second round of shots began, and once again the SEALs found themselves fighting against conditions that seemed determined to defeat them. Sarah's calculations proved correct as each shot fell victim to the same variables that had affected the first round. The targets remained unmarked, and the frustration on everyone's faces grew more evident. Colonel Webb looked at her watch, and then at the team, her expression grave. The deadline was approaching, and with it the moment when she would have to make the call that would end the mission before it began. The radio chatter from headquarters grew more urgent, demanding updates on the team's readiness status. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that her next words would either launch her into a completely new phase of her career or mark the end of her involvement with military operations entirely. The desert fell silent around her, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. #GiveMe1Shot. Part 2. Sarah's voice cut through the desert silence like a blade. Colonel Webb, I'd like to request permission to attempt the qualification shots. The words hung in the air for a moment that felt like an eternity. Every head turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism to outright disbelief. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared beneath his tactical cap, while the other SEALs exchanged glances that clearly questioned whether they had heard correctly. Colonel Webb studied Sarah with the kind of intense scrutiny she usually reserved for mission briefings. Ms. Martinez, you're a civilian contractor assigned to technical analysis. This is a military marksmanship qualification for active combat operations. Yes, ma'am, I understand that, Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. But, with respect, the mission parameters require someone who can make these specific shots under these exact conditions. The question isn't about military status, it's about capability. Staff Sergeant Chen couldn't contain a short laugh. No offense, lady, but do you have any idea what we're dealing with here? These aren't paper targets at a civilian range. We're talking about precision shooting at distances most people can't even comprehend under combat stress conditions. Sarah met his gaze directly. At 1,000 yards, a .338 Lapua Magnum round with a 250-grain bullet traveling at 2,940 feet per second will drop approximately 298 inches in standard atmospheric conditions. But today's temperature is 96 degrees, humidity is at 12%, and the barometric pressure has dropped 2 points since this morning. That changes everything. The technical precision of her response caught everyone off guard. Chen's dismissive smirk faded as he realized she wasn't just making a desperate request. She was demonstrating knowledge that few people outside the special operations community possessed. Rodriguez stepped forward, his curiosity overriding his skepticism. Okay, but knowing the numbers is one thing. Actually making the shot when your hands are shaking and your heart's pounding is something completely different. Combat stress does things to your body that you can't simulate on a training range. You're absolutely right, Sarah acknowledged. But stress affects everyone differently, and sometimes the biggest advantage isn't in being immune to pressure. It's in understanding exactly how that pressure will affect your performance and compensating accordingly. Colonel Webb held up her hand to silence the growing debate. Ms. Martinez, even if you have the theoretical knowledge, there are protocols here. You're not qualified on military weapons systems. You haven't been through the required safety certifications, and, frankly, allowing a civilian to attempt qualification shots could create serious liability issues. Ma'am, I've been documenting every aspect of this training program for 6 months. I'm certified on civilian equivalents of every weapon system being used today, and my security clearance gives me access to operational details that most people in this facility don't have. As for liability, isn't the bigger risk sending a team on a critical mission without confidence in their marksmanship capabilities? The logic of her argument was difficult to dismiss, but Sarah could see the internal conflict playing out on the colonel's face. Military procedures existed for good reasons, and deviating from them, especially in such a visible way, could have career consequences that extended far beyond this single exercise. Harrison, who had been silent through the exchange, finally spoke up. Colonel, what if we approach this differently? Instead of making it an official qualification attempt, what if we just let her take a few shots as a technical demonstration? No official records, no formal certification, just a chance to test whether her theoretical knowledge translates into practical skill. It was a compromise that gave everyone a way to save face. Sarah would get her opportunity without the military having to officially recognize a civilian's performance, and the SEALs could maintain their professional dignity regardless of the outcome. Colonel Webb considered the proposal for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The radio chatter from headquarters continued to demand updates on mission readiness, and time was running out for all of them. Unofficial demonstration only, she finally said. Technical analysis of shooting variables under field conditions. Ms. Martinez, you'll use military equipment under direct supervision, with full safety protocols in effect. This is not a qualification attempt, and the results have no bearing on mission planning. Are we clear? Sarah's heart raced as she nodded agreement, knowing that regardless of the official designation, everything depended on what happened next. The SEALs stepped back to give her room, their expressions ranging from professional curiosity to skeptical anticipation. The rifle felt heavier than she had expected when Harrison handed it to her. The .338 Lapua Magnum was a precision instrument that represented the cutting edge of military marksmanship technology, and holding it made the magnitude of what she was attempting suddenly very real. Sarah forced herself to go through her mental checklist methodically, the way she had practiced countless times in her civilian training. She adjusted the scope to account for the distance, then made micro-adjustments for the environmental conditions she had been tracking all morning. The wind had shifted slightly since the SEALs' failed attempts, creating a new set of variables to consider. As she settled into position behind the rifle, Sarah became aware of how quiet the range had become. The usual background chatter of training exercises had stopped completely, and even the radio traffic seemed muted. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that could either validate years of theoretical study or expose the gap between knowledge and performance in the most public way possible. The target seemed impossibly small through the scope, a tiny mark on the landscape that existed at the very edge of what human vision could detect. At this distance, the bullet would take over a second to reach its destination, during which time wind, gravity, and atmospheric conditions would all conspire to pull it off course. Sarah's breathing slowed automatically as her training took over. Years of studying ballistics had taught her that successful long-range shooting was as much about mental discipline as physical skill. The rifle had to become an extension of her body, and every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. The crosshairs settled on the target, and Sarah made her final calculations. The wind was coming from her right at approximately 8 miles per hour, creating a deflection that required her to aim almost 2 feet to the left of her intended point of impact. The upward angle of the shot meant gravity would have slightly less effect than the table suggested, but the heat distortion could create unpredictable variables right up until the moment of impact. Sarah took a breath, let half of it out, and began to apply pressure to the trigger. The weapon's weight seemed to settle into her shoulder as her finger found the perfect point of contact. Everything around her faded away. The watching crowd, the radio chatter, even the desert heat became irrelevant as her entire world narrowed to the tiny target floating in her scope. The shot surprised her, which was exactly how it was supposed to happen. Good marksmanship required the trigger pull to be so smooth and controlled that the actual moment of firing came as a gentle surprise rather than an anticipated jerk that could throw off the weapon's alignment. The rifle's recoil drove back into her shoulder with familiar force, and the sound echoed across the desert like thunder. Sarah immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round, maintaining her position behind the scope so she could observe the bullet's impact. Through the scope, she could see the spotting team at the target location frantically checking their equipment and consulting with each other through hand signals. The delay seemed to stretch on forever, each second adding weight to the silence that had fallen over the entire range. Then, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, his tone carrying a mix of disbelief and respect that was impossible to miss. Center hit. Dead center. Repeat. We have a confirmed center hit at 1,000 yards. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Harrison releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Sarah remained in position, her eyes still at the scope, but she could feel the weight of everyone's stares as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. Chin shook his head slowly, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional recognition. Okay, that was impressive, but one shot could be luck. The qualification requires 3 consecutive hits under varying conditions. Colonel Webb stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Ms. Martinez, that was an exceptional shot under challenging conditions. However, Sergeant Chun is correct. Consistency is what separates luck from skill. Are you prepared to attempt the remaining qualification shots? Sarah knew that she was already far beyond what she had originally dared to hope for. The first shot had proven that her understanding of the science was correct, but Chun was right about consistency being the true test. In combat situations, there were no second chances for missed shots, and the mission's success depended on absolute confidence in the marksman's ability to deliver under pressure. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'd like to complete the full demonstration." The second target was positioned at 1,200 yards, a distance that pushed the limits of what even specialized military rifles could achieve reliably. The environmental conditions had also changed as the desert sun climbed higher, creating new thermal effects that would alter the bullet's flight path in subtle but critical ways. As Sarah prepared for her second shot, she realized that everything she had worked for over the past 6 years had led to this moment. The countless hours of study, the technical analysis, the patience required to build credibility in a world that had initially seen her as an outsider. All of it came down to whether she could prove that knowledge and determination could compete with tradition and established hierarchy. The desert wind shifted again, and Sarah adjusted her calculations accordingly. The target wavered in the heat shimmer like a mirage, but her scope's advanced optics cut through the distortion to provide a clear picture of her objective. Around her, the tension was palpable as everyone waited to see whether her first shot had been the beginning of something extraordinary or simply a moment of unexpected luck that would be quickly forgotten. #GiveMeOneShot. Part 3. Sarah's second shot rang out across the Nevada desert with the same authority as the first, but this time she felt different. The initial success had burned away her nervousness, replacing it with the kind of focused confidence that comes from knowing your preparation was thorough and your execution was sound. The rifle felt like a natural extension of her body now, and the complex calculations that had once required conscious effort were flowing through her mind automatically. The radio crackled again with Rodriguez's voice, this time carrying a note of amazement that he couldn't quite suppress. "Second hit confirmed. Clean center shot at 1,200 yards. This is unbelievable." Colonel Webb's expression had evolved from skepticism through surprise to something approaching professional admiration. She keyed her own radio to respond to the increasingly urgent inquiries from headquarters. "Command, this is Range 7. We may have found a solution to our marksmanship requirement." Harrison stepped closer to Sarah's position, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that was usually reserved for fellow warriors who had proven themselves under fire. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen shooting like that under these conditions. What's your background?" Sarah kept her eye to the scope as she prepared for the third and final shot, but she answered in the same steady tone she had maintained throughout the demonstration. "I grew up on a ranch in Montana. My father taught me to shoot when I was 8, and I've been studying long-range marksmanship as a technical discipline ever since. I have a master's degree in applied physics with a focus on ballistics, and I've spent the last 6 years analyzing every aspect of precision shooting for military applications." "But no military training?" Chen asked, his tone now carrying curiosity rather than skepticism. "No formal military training," Sarah confirmed. "But I've observed and documented thousands of hours of military marksmanship training, studied every manual and technical publication the military has produced on the subject, and spent my own time and money pursuing advanced civilian training with some of the best instructors in the country." The third target had been positioned at 1,100 yards with additional complications. The shooting angle had been changed to simulate the exact conditions they would face on the upcoming mission, including a significant elevation differential and a crosswind that had been measured at the target location to be different from the conditions at the firing position. These were the kinds of variables that separated theoretical knowledge from practical expertise. Wind conditions could vary significantly over the distance a bullet traveled, and compensating for those differences required an intuitive understanding of how air currents behaved in different terrain features. Sarah had been studying the topography between her position and the target for the past few minutes, noting how the desert landscape would channel and redirect the wind at different points along the bullet's flight path. The terrain included a small ridge that would create turbulence, followed by a depression that would cause the wind to accelerate before the final approach to the target across relatively flat ground. As she made her calculations, Sarah became aware that her performance was being observed by more than just the training team. Word had spread quickly through the facility, and other personnel had found reasons to be in the area where they could witness what was happening. The unofficial nature of the demonstration hadn't prevented it from becoming a significant event. The pressure of additional attention might have been overwhelming under different circumstances, but Sarah found that her focus had actually sharpened. Years of detailed study had prepared her for exactly these conditions, and she felt a deep confidence that came from knowing she understood every variable that could affect her shot. She settled into her final shooting position with the kind of deliberate precision that had become second nature through countless hours of practice. The rifle's weight distributed perfectly across her body, and her breathing fell into the rhythmic pattern that would ensure her body was completely still at the moment of firing. Through the scope, the target seemed even smaller at this distance and angle. The heat shimmer was more pronounced now that the sun had climbed higher, creating distortions that could easily fool the eye. But Sarah had learned to read through the mirage, understanding how the light bent and twisted to create illusions that could throw off even experienced marksmen. The wind had picked up slightly, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging shot. Sarah could see dust devils forming in the distance, indicating that the thermal conditions were becoming increasingly unstable. In another hour, accurate shooting at this distance would become nearly impossible. She made her final adjustments to the scope and checked her position one last time. Everything felt right. The rifle was perfectly aligned, her body was stable and relaxed, and her mind was clear of distractions. The target floated steadily in her crosshairs despite the environmental chaos surrounding her. Sarah began her trigger squeeze with the same deliberate control she had used for the previous shots. The trigger's resistance was familiar now, and she knew exactly where the breakpoint would occur. Her breathing stopped naturally at the bottom of her respiratory cycle, and her finger applied steady pressure while her mind made final micro-adjustments for the wind conditions. The shot seemed to happen in slow motion, with Sarah aware of every detail from the moment the firing pin struck the primer to the recoil that drove the rifle back into her shoulder. She worked the bolt immediately and maintained her position behind the scope, watching for the bullet's impact while simultaneously preparing for a possible follow-up shot if it became necessary. The wait seemed longer this time, partly because the distance was greater, but mostly because everyone present understood that this shot would determine whether the morning's events would be remembered as an extraordinary demonstration or dismissed as an interesting anomaly. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with barely contained excitement. Third hit confirmed. Perfect center shot at 1,100 yards with full environmental complications. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a marksman. The cheers that erupted from the assembled personnel were immediately suppressed by Colonel Webb's raised hand. But the enthusiasm was impossible to miss. Sarah finally lifted her head from the scope and looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing expressions that ranged from admiration to outright amazement. Chun extended his hand with a grin that transformed his entire face. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. That was some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed, and I've worked with the best marksmen in the military. Your theoretical knowledge clearly translates into practical skill at the highest level." Colonel Webb approached with a radio in hand, her expression serious despite the success of the demonstration. "Ms. Martinez, I have headquarters on the line asking for a full briefing on our marksmanship capabilities. Based on what I've just witnessed, I'm going to recommend that you be considered for direct participation in the upcoming mission." The words hit Sarah like a physical impact. She had hoped that her performance might lead to greater involvement in future projects or perhaps a more significant role in weapons development. She had never imagined that a single morning's shooting could result in an invitation to participate in an actual combat operation. "Colonel, I'm honored by the recommendation, but I'm not military personnel. I don't have combat training or experience with the operational aspects of special missions. My expertise is limited to the technical aspects of marksmanship." Harrison stepped forward with the kind of calm authority that had made him an effective leader in countless dangerous situations. "Ma'am, with respect, what you just demonstrated goes well beyond technical knowledge. You showed the kind of mental discipline and performance under pressure that we spend years trying to develop in our operators. The mission we're discussing requires one specific skill set: the ability to make precision shots at extreme range under adverse conditions. You've just proven that you possess that skill at a level that exceeds our current capabilities." The radio in Colonel Webb's hand crackled with an urgent voice from headquarters demanding immediate updates on mission readiness. The bureaucratic reality of military operations was reasserting itself, and decisions needed to be made quickly. "Ms. Martinez," the colonel said, "I need to give headquarters a definitive answer about our marksmanship capabilities within the next hour. The mission timeline cannot be adjusted, and we cannot afford to deploy without absolute confidence in our precision shooting ability. Based on your performance today, I believe you represent our best chance of mission success." Sarah realized that she was being offered an opportunity that would fundamentally change her life. 6 years of studying military marksmanship from the outside had led to a chance to participate directly in the kind of operation she had only read about in classified briefings. But the decision carried enormous responsibilities. Real lives would depend on her ability to perform under conditions far more stressful than a training range. The theoretical knowledge that had served her so well during the demonstration would be tested in an environment where failure could have catastrophic consequences. The desert wind picked up again, swirling dust around the group and reminding everyone of the challenging conditions that had made the morning's shooting so impressive. Sarah looked out at the targets that now bore the evidence of her precision, then back at the faces of the military professionals who had accepted her as an equal based solely on her demonstrated ability. "Colonel Webb," she said, her voice steady and clear, "if the mission requires these specific marksmanship skills, and if my participation could contribute to its success, then I'm prepared to accept whatever role you determine is appropriate." The words seemed to hang in the desert air for a moment before Colonel Webb nodded with the kind of decisive authority that had carried her through a distinguished military career. "Outstanding. We'll need to begin mission briefings immediately and arrange for accelerated security clearances for operational details. Gentlemen, it looks like we have our marksman." As the group began to disperse toward the briefing facilities, Sarah remained at the firing line for a moment, looking out at the targets that had changed everything. The morning had begun with her role as an outside observer, and it was ending with an invitation to step inside the world she had studied for so long. The desert sun was approaching its zenith, and the heat shimmer that had complicated her shooting was becoming more pronounced. In a few hours, the environmental conditions would make precision shooting nearly impossible. But for now, in this moment, Sarah had proven that sometimes the best preparation for the unexpected comes not from following the established path, but from understanding the science so thoroughly that you can succeed where others fail. The radio chatter from headquarters continued with increased urgency as mission planning shifted into high gear. Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to enter a world where her theoretical knowledge would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The desert wind carried the promise of challenges ahead, but also the satisfaction of knowing that when given one shot, she had made it count.